Have you ever wondered, like, in the Philippines, where we're all striving for justice, right? How could someone be acquitted in a drug case even when the drugs are right there? Even when it's confirmed there were drugs.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. It makes you think about, like, how do we balance catching criminals, but also making sure everyone's rights are protected, like that whole due process thing?
It's a tough one. And it really makes you question, how does our legal system actually work here in the Philippines? How does due process actually play out in real life?
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. There's this Supreme Court case that just went viral, and it highlights this tension perfectly.
Yeah, this case, it brings up so many questions, like what happens when the rules of procedure, those legal steps, aren't followed exactly right, especially in something as serious as a drug case.
Right, right. We're going to break it all down, the facts, what happened in the lower courts, and then the Supreme Court's final decision. You might be surprised by some of the details.
Definitely. So let's start with the basics. What was this case all about?
This case, it's called Joel Largo versus People of the Philippines. The case number is GR No 2012-93, and the Supreme Court decided it on June 19, 2019.
2019. Okay. So what was it about this case that really caught everyone's attention?
Well, it basically shows just how important the legal process is, especially when the stakes are so high, like in drug cases where the penalties can be pretty serious.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to the beginning. Can you set the scene for us? Like, when and where did this all start?
Okay, so picture this. November 28, 2005, around 1 in the afternoon. We're in the middle of Carbon Public Market in Cebu City. Lots of people, lots of activity.
Carbon Market, that place is always buzzing.
It is, it is. So the Barangay tanods there, they got a tip, some information that there was a pot session going on, like on the second floor of one of the units there in the market.
Okay, so they went to check it out.
Yeah, exactly. And when they got there, people started scattering, trying to get away, and that's when they saw Joel Largo.
Largo, okay. What happened with him?
Well, he apparently ran right towards one of the Barangay tanods, a guy named Vicente Bosque. And while he was running, he supposedly, flicked something away, a small plastic sachet.
Oh, so that's where the drugs come in.
Yeah, so they found this sachet, and it turned out to have a tiny amount, just 0.05 gram of some white crystalline substance.
0.05 gram? That's hardly anything.
Yeah, it was a really small amount. But later on, it was confirmed to be methamphetamine hydrochloride, or Shabu, as we call it.
Okay, so they caught him basically red-handed.
Well, that's what it seems like at first. So Barangay Tanod Bosque, he arrested Largo right there and then, picked up the sachet, and held onto it until they got to the police station.
Makes sense. And what happened at the police station?
At the station, Bosque turned the sachet over to the investigator on duty, a police officer named SPO1 Romeo Abelana.
Okay, SPO1 Abelana. What did you do?
He marked it, to make sure it was properly identified with the initials JLA.
JLA for Joel Largo, I'm guessing.
Exactly. So everything seemed to be following the standard procedure, right?
Yeah, I mean, so far so good. What happened next?
Well, then another Barangay Tanod, Venancio Catalan, he took the mark sachet to the PNP crime laboratory, the usual process.
Right, to get it analyzed.
Yeah. So a forensic chemist at the lab, PS Your Insp, David Alexander Patriana, he ran some tests on it.
And I'm assuming those tests confirmed it was Shabu.
They did. And the prosecution, they even used the request for the examination and the chemist report, chemistry report number D1806-2005, as evidence in the trial.
So it seems pretty open and shut, right? They caught him with the drugs, the lab confirmed it.
You'd think so, but the defense, they had a completely different story to tell.
Oh. Okay, so what was Largo's side of the story? What did his defense team argue?
Their argument was that Largo's arrest wasn't legal at all. They said that he was actually arrested the day before this whole market incident on November 27th.
Wait, so a whole day earlier?
Yeah. According to Largo, he was just waiting for a jeepney when some Barangay tanods came up to him just out of the blue and took him to the Barangay Hall.
That's wild. And they just held him there.
That's what he claimed. He said they detained him without any kind of investigation, and they didn't even tell him why they were holding him. He said he only learned about the drug charges against him much later.
So the defense was saying that this whole drug bust at the market was basically fabricated.
That was their argument. They were saying that the whole incident was made up and that Largo was already in custody when they supposedly caught him with the drugs.
That's a pretty serious accusation. Did the defense have any evidence to back up their claims?
They did present some evidence. For example, a relative of Largo, his mother-in-law's brother, He testified that Largo had asked for permission to go home to Basak, Cebu City, on November 27th.
Okay, so that kind of supports the idea that Largo was actually somewhere else when they said he was at the market.
Right. And then they had some other documents, too, a prosecutor's resolution that had initially recommended dismissing the case.
Oh, interesting. So even the prosecutor wasn't initially convinced they had a strong case.
Yeah, it seems that way, though it looks like that recommendation was later overturned for some reason. They also had an affidavit, a police blotter certification related to Largo's arrest, and his own sworn statement called a counter affidavit.
Wow, so they had a lot of paperwork to support their version of events.
They did. So, with all these conflicting accounts and evidence, the case went to trial.
Right, so what happened in the lower courts?
Well, the trial court actually sided with the prosecution.
They did. So they believed the Barangay tanods version of the story.
Yeah. They found Largo guilty of illegal possession of dangerous drugs.
Oh, wow. And what was his sentence?
He was sentenced to 12 years and 1 day to 15 years in prison, and he had to pay a fine of P350,000.
That's a huge fine.
Yeah.
So the trial court really believed the prosecution had a solid case.
Yeah. They said they found the tanods testimony credible and that the chain of custody of the seized drug, for the most part, was maintained.
Okay, chain of custody. We're going to come back to that.
Yeah.
So the trial court found him guilty. What about the Court of Appeals? Did they agree?
They did. The Court of Appeals also affirmed the guilty verdict. They upheld the trial court's decision and denied Largo's motion for reconsideration.
So at this point, it's looking pretty bleak for Largo.
Yeah, it seemed like that, but then it went to the Supreme Court.
Okay, and that's where things get really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So what were the big legal questions that the Supreme Court had to grapple with in this case?
Well, there were two main issues. First was Largo's arrest, without a warrant. Was that actually legal?
Right, because the defense was arguing it wasn't.
Exactly. And the second big question was, did the prosecution actually follow the chain of custody rule properly for the drug evidence?
Chain of custody, that seems to be the key here.
It was, and what the Supreme Court decided on this issue, it really made people sit up and take notice.
Okay, so tell us, what was the Supreme Court's final decision?
Okay, so first, on the warrantless arrest, the Supreme Court, they did acknowledge that there were questions about its legality.
Oh, so they agreed there were problems with how he was arrested.
Yeah, but they said that Largo had essentially waived his right to challenge the arrest because he participated in the trial. He went through the arraignment where the charges are read out in court without objecting to the arrest.
So because he didn't object right away, he lost the chance to challenge it later.
That's right. So that wasn't the reason they ruled in his favor.
It all came down to the chain of custody.
It did. The Supreme Court, they basically said the prosecution messed up big time.
Yeah.
They didn't prove a clear and unbroken chain of custody for the drug evidence.
So even though there was this drug evidence, because they didn't handle it properly, Largo went free.
Yeah, that's essentially what happened. The Supreme Court said that because they didn't follow the chain of custody, it created doubt about the evidence itself. And that doubt was enough to acquit him.
Okay, I think we need to break down this chain of custody thing. What exactly went wrong, according to the Supreme Court?
So they went through each step, right? Starting with the very first one, when they seized the sachet and how they marked it.
Right, back at the carbon market.
Yeah, and Barangay Tanod boss, the one who arrested Largo, he admitted during his testimony that he didn't mark the sachet right there at the scene.
Oh, so he didn't mark it immediately.
No, he didn't. And the Supreme Court was very clear that it needs to be marked right away, like right when they seize it, ideally in front of the person they're arresting.
So there's no question it's the same thing.
Exactly. That way there's no chance of tampering or mixing it up with something else.
Right, makes sense. And they didn't do that.
Nope. And to make things worse, there was no evidence that they did a physical inventory of the drugs right there, or that they took pictures of it at the scene or at the nearest police station.
Oh, so they skipped some important steps right from the beginning.
They did. And that was just the first link in the chain.
So what about the rest of the chain? What other problems did they find?
Well, the Supreme Court, they also pointed out problems with the third and fourth links. The third link is when they transfer the drug from the investigator, SPO1 Avellana, to the forensic chemist.
Right, so from the police to the lab.
Yeah. So we know Barangay Tanod Catalan took the sachet to the crime lab after Avellana prepared the request for examination.
Right, so far so good.
But the problem is, Avellana himself, he never testified about what he did with the drug from the time he got it from Bosque to when it was sent to the lab.
So there's a gap in the story there. We don't know what happened to the evidence during that time.
Exactly. It's like a missing piece of the puzzle. And then the fourth link, that's when they transfer the drug from the chemist to the court.
Right, so it can be presented as evidence.
Yeah. But again, the forensic chemist, P.S. Ins Patriana, he also didn't testify about how he handled the drug, how he made sure it wasn't tampered with.
So another missing piece of the puzzle.
And the biggest thing, there was no evidence of who actually brought the drug from the crime lab to the court.
Wow, so they couldn't even prove that the thing they were presenting in court was the same thing that was originally seized?
That's the problem. There were so many breaks in the chain of custody. And the Supreme Court, they said that in drug cases, the prosecution, they have to be really, really sure. They have to prove what they call the corpus delicti.
Corpus delicti. What's that?
It means body of the crime. In this case, it's the drug itself. They have to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the drug they're presenting in court is the same one that was seized from the accused.
Makes sense. And in this case, they couldn't do that.
They couldn't. And all these mistakes, all these gaps in the chain of custody, it created enough doubt to acquit Largo.
But hold on, didn't the court mention something about a saving clause?
Yeah, there is a rule in the implementing rules and regulations of RA 9165, the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act. It says that you can deviate from the chain of custody rules, but only if there's a good reason.
Oh, so like an emergency or something.
Yeah, or if they can prove that the evidence wasn't tampered with, even though they didn't follow all the steps. But in Largo's case, the Supreme Court said it didn't apply.
Why not?
Because the Barangay tanods and everyone else who handled the evidence, they didn't give any good reason for why they didn't follow the rules. They just didn't do it.
So even though there's this saving clause, it doesn't mean you can just ignore the rules.
Exactly. And the court also talked about that whole idea of law enforcement being presumed to have acted correctly.
Right, like they're just doing their job.
Yeah, but the Supreme Court was very clear that this presumption, it doesn't apply when there's clear evidence that they messed up.
So just because someone's a police officer or a Barangay tanod, it doesn't mean they can do whatever they want.
Right. And they emphasize that the most important thing is the presumption of innocence.
That's a big one.
It is. It means that everyone, even someone accused of a crime, they're considered innocent until proven guilty. And the burden of proof is always on the prosecution.
So in the end, the Supreme Court decided to let Largo go.
Yeah, they granted his petition, reversed the Court of Appeals decision, and acquitted him of the drug charges.
It's pretty amazing, even though they found drugs because they didn't follow the rules, he was set free.
It is, and it really shows how important the legal process is, how important it is to do things by the book.
I mean, this case really makes you think, right? Like, what does it say about our justice system here in the Philippines? We're all for catching criminals, but we also need to make sure everyone gets a fair trial.
Yeah, that's the balance we're always striving for. This case highlights how crucial due process is, even in cases involving drugs, which everyone's understandably concerned about.
It's a complex issue, for sure. So for our listeners out there, what are some key takeaways from this case?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the chain of custody. It's so important to make sure the evidence is handled properly every step of the way.
Right, and we've talked a lot about that. But can you remind us again, what exactly is the chain of custody?
It's basically a record of everyone who's handled the evidence, from the moment it's seized to when it's presented in court. It's all about making sure the evidence is authentic, that it hasn't been tampered with.
Right, like a paper trail for the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And you also mentioned corpus delicti.
Yeah, the corpus delicti, that's the essential element of the crime. In a drug case, it's the drug itself. The prosecution has to prove, without a doubt, that what they're presenting in court is the same substance that was seized from the accused.
And, of course, we can't forget about the presumption of innocence.
That's a cornerstone of our legal system. It means everyone is considered innocent until proven guilty, and it's the prosecution's job to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
And just to clarify one more time, what about that waiver of objection to a legal arrest?
Basically, if you're arrested and you believe it was illegal, you have to object right away, before the trial even starts. Otherwise, you lose the right to challenge the arrest later on.
So, lots of legal intricacies to consider. What do you think is the most important message for our listeners to take away from the Largo case?
Well, for me, it really underscores that everyone deserves a fair trial, regardless of the accusations against them. The prosecution can't just cut corners. They have to follow the rules, and they have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt.
It's a powerful reminder that the justice system is there to protect everyone's rights, not just the victims of crime.
Exactly. And if the system fails to uphold those rights, even in cases that seem open and shut, then justice hasn't truly been served.
This case really does raise a lot of important questions. We'd love to hear what you think about it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of the chain of custody do you find most important?
And if you found this deep dive insightful, please don't forget to hit that favorite button. It helps others discover this important conversation.
And if you're interested in exploring more fascinating legal cases like this one, and you want to understand Philippine law better, make sure to subscribe to the deep dive.
That's right. We take you behind the headlines. We provide the context and the in-depth analysis that you won't find anywhere else. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of informed listeners. We'll see you in the next deep dive.